Well, my name is Michael Bird, and I'm an enrolled member of the Santo Domingo or Kewa Pueblo tribe in New Mexico. I think for some degree of notoriety that I've obtained, I am the first American Indian to have ever served as president of the American Public Health Association. And actually, it's my 20th anniversary since I was president of APHA. And I've been involved in public social work, public health, uh, and both with my tribe. So in the tribal arena, in on the national level, and have had some opportunities to engage on an international level as well. After I started in medical social work in the Santa Fe Indian Hospital, that would have been in the early late 70s. I had the opportunity to attend a conference in Phoenix, and it was my first opportunity to travel as a professional. And so we went to Phoenix, and I was all excited because it was my first training opportunity to kind of be out there as this young Indian social worker professional. And so I went to the conference, and invariably back in those days, the presenter was, I think, a young or someone older than me, clearly, but white professional, either an MD or a PhD, and he was presenting on Native populations, and so he, as oftentimes would be the case, went through his data about Indian people having highest depression rates, high substance abuse rates, high rates of suicide and violence. And so, it was your standard, as I've come to learn for the most part up until recently, was pretty much your standard presentation at that point in time. And I sat there and was kind of just reflecting on what he was sharing. And so then there was question and answers, and I couldn't help but raise my hand and say, this is, sort of my first professional sort of conference. And I think your presentation, it was a good presentation. I said, but as someone who's Native, I says, I feel like I want to drink. I feel suicidal. I feel like violent and totally totally depressed. I said, and of course everyone in the audience laughed. I think what has happened, what in my evolution and my understanding of things, is one of the things that has happened is, at that point in time, that was typical, but is somewhat still typical of people external to the Indian community defining Indian people as the problem. And in my political, social, cultural evolution over the years, what I've come to understand and recognize is that we, in fact, were not the problem. We reflected a problem, but the real issue has been for Native people and many other people as well, is what happened to us, and that if one does not understand the historical context of what Native people have experienced in this country, one can really never appreciate, nor are you really going to ever address those issues that have impacted Indian people, because you don't really understand what those issues are. There is some indigenous knowledge and wisdom that has been ignored and minimized, and people right now, I think, really are in search of some answers, and those answers do not always come from technology or science, although I believe in science. But there are some traditional values that we have not really allowed and heard from Native people, from indigenous people, who've endured and survived over thousands of years with any cultural group. There is a way of learning, a way of understanding the world, the natural world, and the environment that they lived in, because their survival was contingent upon their understanding their natural world. Um, and we live in a society, when societies now that are really detached and alienated from those natural environments for the most part, not completely. Um, but I think that the the indigenous sort of knowledge is is and has always been relevant. It's just that um, it's just this ethnocentric sort of perspective that has been promoted in Western cultures, that minimizes and has failed to recognize the value of that knowledge. To quote a phrase, Will Rogers, Cherokee Indian, one of my favorite sayings is he was known to say, "We're all ignorant, just about different things." And if you're not open to admitting, because you're of an ethnocentric perspective, if you're not open to admitting that there are areas that you are lacking in your knowledge base, then you have nothing to learn, and you won't learn what you need to know, particularly when it applies to working with any culture that is not your own. If you think you have all the answers, then then there's not going to be any success. And we've seen that demonstrated in the policies that were developed for Indian people over the past, 250 250 years since the United States government was constituted, in terms of the policies that were implemented, in terms of education policies, in terms of social policies, in terms of economic policies. Those oftentimes were not based on any sort of um, any sort of consultation or understanding of the context in which Native people lived, and what would work and what wouldn't work. And we've seen those policies fail in terms of boarding schools. In many cases, they cause more problems than they resolved. In terms of the theft of land, in terms of a whole host of policies that really were imposed upon Native people and didn't come from Native people, and Native people were not asked for, were not allowed to offer their own thoughts and their own perspectives on what might best serve them. I'm happy to say that social justice and racism are issues that public health is tackling. The American Public Health Association is involved in addressing those issues, reflecting the needs of the members, and a diverse membership: African American, American Indian, Mexican American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian. One of the best things that's happened, in a positive note, and I can say this very clearly, is there are a greater number now of Native people who have credentials in mental health, in social work, and behavioral health, and more moving into academic settings doing research. Um, so that I think is it's easier. First of all, it's easier for most of us to talk and relate to somebody who looks like us and who's had some of the experiences we have. If you're working with any cultural group, if I'm going to New York and I'm working with a white community, be it Italians or Jews or whatever group, the first thing I would want to know is what's their history, what has been their historical experience. That's where I would come from, because I know that's important. You have to understand where people have come from, what has been their experience. So I really think that it really starts out with anyone who wants to work in any cultural group that is different than the one that they come from. Really, you have to ask your question. I mean, it starts with asking yourself some basic questions, and that is, what are you willing to learn? And are you willing to question some of the things that you've been taught and that you believe? If you're going to be dealing with any American Indian population, any cultural population, even one's own community, what level of commitment does one bring to the conversation and to one's work? And what is the basis of that motivation? Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it? Whose needs are you meeting? I think one has to be careful that you don't allow your own issues to cloud your vision and your perspective when you're working to serve someone else and meet their needs. And so the real thing that one needs to understand is understand one's values, one's own tradition, one's own history, and one's motivation. Because you can't help anybody unless you really have helped yourself. And on that note, I would say that I would be a pretty good therapist now, a lot better than I was back in 1977 and 78 and 79 and 80, when I actually was engaged in medical social work and some degree of counseling and working with people, because now I have two things. One is a broader base of knowledge of people, but I also know myself better than I did then. I have hope. I believe that can we can move things in a better direction.